The Heir in the Shadows. Robert Durst was born in 1943 into one of New York's wealthiest real estate families. His father, Seymour Durst, controlled a vast empire, and Robert, as the eldest son, was expected to inherit the family business. From the outside, the Dursts appeared to have a perfect life. But beneath this facade, Robert's childhood was marked by tragedy and turmoil, leaving scars that would shape his future. The most significant event of Robert's early years occurred when he was just 7 years old. His mother, Bernice Durst, died after falling from the roof of their family home in what was reported as a suicide. Robert later claimed that he witnessed his mother's fatal fall, an event that haunted him for the rest of his life. The trauma from his mother's death and the emotional neglect he felt from his father left Robert isolated and estranged from his family. Seymour Durst, a cold and controlling figure, focused on grooming Robert's younger brother, Douglas, to take over the family business, effectively sidelining Robert. This rejection deepened Robert's resentment and fueled his rebellious nature. Despite his prestigious background, Robert became increasingly detached from the responsibilities and expectations placed upon him. In the early 1970s, Robert married Kathleen McCormack, a young medical student. Their relationship started with promise, but it quickly soured. Robert's behavior grew erratic, and the couple's arguments became more frequent. By 1981, their marriage had deteriorated to the point of no return. Then, in January 1982, Kathy disappeared without a trace after a reported argument with Robert at their weekend home in South Salem, New York. Although Robert was immediately suspected in Kathy's disappearance, he maintained that he had dropped her off at the train station to return to Manhattan. No one ever saw her again. Despite inconsistencies in Robert's account, the police lacked enough evidence to charge him, and the case gradually went cold. Kathy's disappearance marked the beginning of a long and bizarre series of events surrounding Robert Durst. From this point on, his life would be overshadowed by accusations, investigations, and death. Yet for many years, Robert seemed untouchable, managing to evade justice while living under the shadow of his family's wealth and influence. The runaway and the bizarre. After the disappearance of his wife Kathy in 1982, Robert Durst's life took an increasingly strange and erratic turn. Though suspicion hung over him, no charges were filed, and the case grew cold. Free from the weight of prosecution, Durst drifted away from his privileged life in New York. Over the next few years, he distanced himself from his family's powerful real estate empire, adopting a nomadic and often bizarre lifestyle. Durst's closest confidant during this time was Susan Berman, a journalist and the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster. Berman had a deep loyalty to Durst and acted as his spokesperson during the initial investigations into Kathy's disappearance. Despite her colorful background and shady connections, Susan was fiercely protective of Robert, becoming one of the few people he truly trusted. But by the late 1990s, as authorities reopened the investigation into Kathy's disappearance, Susan's closeness to Robert became a dangerous liability. She knew too much about his life and the dark secrets that surrounded him. In December 2000, Susan was found murdered in her Los Angeles home, shot execution style. Investigators quickly suspected that her death was connected to Robert Durst, but there was no immediate evidence linking him to the crime. Once again, Durst seemed to escape justice. Meanwhile, Robert's behavior grew more erratic. He adopted aliases, frequently changed his appearance, and led an isolated life. In one of his most bizarre decisions, he moved to Galveston, Texas, where he disguised himself as a mute woman named Dorothy Sinner to avoid detection. It was here that Durst's life took another dark turn when his elderly neighbor, Morris Black, was found dismembered and floating in Galveston Bay in 2001. Durst was arrested for Morris Black's murder, but his defense claimed it had been an act of self-defense during a struggle. Astonishingly, despite Durst's confession to dismembering the body and fleeing after the killing, he was acquitted of the murder charges. The jury accepted his claim of self-defense, and once again, Robert slipped through the cracks of the justice system. By now, Durst had become a figure shrouded in mystery, connected to 3 deaths but never held accountable. His ability to evade justice seemed almost supernatural, as though nothing could touch him. The secrets unravel. By the early 2000s, Robert Durst had managed to evade justice in connection with the disappearances and deaths of his wife, Kathy McCormack, his close friend, Susan Berman, and his neighbor, Morris Black. However, his luck began to change when filmmaker Andrew Jarecki decided to investigate Durst's life in a documentary series called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. What started as a project to understand Durst's troubled past soon became the key to unraveling his darkest secrets. In The Jinx, Jarecki and his team meticulously pieced together Durst's life and the suspicious deaths surrounding him. They interviewed former detectives, friends, and witnesses, all while probing deeper into the cold cases. The most striking aspect of the series was its access to Durst himself. He agreed to sit for extended interviews, offering candid and at times unsettling insights into his thoughts and actions. Durst's willingness to participate seemed almost arrogant, as if he believed no one could catch him. The investigation into Susan Berman's death became a central focus of the documentary. Berman, a journalist, was murdered in 2000, just as police were reopening the case into Kathy McCormack's disappearance. The documentary team uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that tied Durst to the crime. A letter sent to the police after Berman's murder, alerting them to a cadaver in her home. The handwriting on the note was strikingly similar to Durst's own handwriting. This was the first time the public saw such damning evidence against him. The pivotal moment in the series came when Jarecki confronted Durst with this new evidence. Durst's reaction was odd but not immediate. However, after the interview, he retreated to the bathroom, unaware that his microphone was still on. In a moment of apparent self-reflection, he muttered, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This moment of confession sent shockwaves through the legal and media worlds. Though it wasn't an official admission in court, it gave prosecutors the push they needed to reopen investigations and finally pursue charges. Durst, who had always seemed untouchable, had unknowingly given investigators the break they had been waiting for. His carefully constructed life of evasion was beginning to unravel the reckoning. After the bombshell revelation in The Jinx, Robert Durst's carefully hidden secrets began to surface. His off-camera admission, "Killed them all, of course," marked a turning point in the legal pursuit of a man who had evaded justice for decades. In 2015, shortly before the final episode of the documentary aired, Durst was arrested in New Orleans, charged with the murder of Susan Berman, his close friend who had been killed execution-style in 2000. Durst's trial for Berman's murder took years to materialize, delayed by legal maneuvering and Durst's deteriorating health. But in 2020, nearly 20 years after Berman's death, the trial finally began in Los Angeles. The prosecution presented a damning case. Susan Berman had been preparing to speak with investigators about the reopened case of Kathy McCormack's disappearance when she was silenced by Durst. They highlighted Durst's consistent pattern of removing people who could expose him, first Kathy, then Susan, and later Morris Black. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the cadaver note, a letter sent to the police after Berman's murder that only the killer could have written. Handwriting analysis showed that the note was identical to Durst's own writing, and the Jinx had captured Durst's stunned silence when confronted with this evidence. The trial was riveting, and the public eagerly awaited the verdict, wondering if Durst would finally be held accountable after decades of suspicion. In September 2021, Robert Durst was found guilty of Susan Berman's murder. It was a monumental moment, the first time Durst had been convicted of a serious crime, despite a lifetime of investigations surrounding the deaths of those close to him. Just days after the conviction, prosecutors in New York charged Durst with the murder of his first wife, Kathy McCormack, finally bringing her case back into the spotlight after nearly 40 years. However, Durst's reckoning would be cut short. In January 2022, while serving a life sentence for Berman's murder, Robert Durst died in prison at the age of 78, succumbing to various medical conditions. His death marked the end of a long, twisted saga, one that saw him evade justice for decades but ultimately fall. Robert Durst's life was a tangled web of privilege, manipulation, and murder. While he escaped formal punishment for most of his life, his final years were spent in the confines of a prison cell, his legacy forever tainted by the lives lost in his wake.